Chapter 2, Transformative. Dani looked sound asleep when they reached her room. Jack was hovering. He nodded to Sam and Tanya as they entered.
Oh, good. Can you two watch her for a minute? I need to talk to Maddie.
They nodded, and Jack hurried out of the room, glancing back at Dani as he left. Sam sat down on the edge of the bed and frowned.
Does she look a little pale?
Tanya shrugged, her hands still shaking.
I don't know. Maybe? Should we have told them that she was in the portal when it went off?
Sam shook his head slightly.
No. What about what we saw? The other girl.
Tanya buried her head in her hands, long black dreads slipping out from under her red beret as she shook her head.
It sort of looked like Dani, but dead.
The word slipped from Sam's mouth before he could stop it. Tanya looked up at her friend, tears welling in her eyes.
Sam, what if she doesn't wake up?
But before the panic could build further, a groan sounded from the bed. Both of them froze, eyes fixed on Dani as she moved for the first time since collapsing in the lab. She tossed her arm over her eyes, blocking out the overhead light. She wrinkled her nose and groaned again.
Why is everything so sore?
But even as she spoke, her voice back to normal, not the echoing wisp it had been, a ring of light blossomed around her middle and split, leaving her once again the white-haired girl who had stumbled out of the portal. Dani, though, hadn't noticed, even as Tanya and Sam stared. She blinked bright, glowing green eyes at them as she sat up.
What? Do I have something on my face?
She asked, rubbing her face and frowning at her glove.
Why is my glove white?
Sam took a steadying breath and spoke, surprised when his voice came out completely calm.
Dani, I need you to look at yourself in the mirror. I also need you to not completely panic.
She frowned at him, and he noticed that the green in her eyes swirled and moved with her every movement.
What are you talking about?
Her voice echoed and Tanya jumped as a few pencils began to float. Sam somehow remained calm.
Just trust me, okay?
He reached out a hand to her and she shook her head.
We were in the lab. Why aren't we in the lab?
Tanya took matters into her own hands, snatching a small hand mirror off the small vanity in the room and holding it out to Dani. She snatched it from her friend and blinked at her reflection.
What the fuck? What's going on?
She was starting to shake. As she did, she lifted off the bed until she was floating.
Dani?
Sam reached out to her, only to have his hand pass through her arm as if it wasn't even there. Tanya bit back a scream as the mirror dropped from a hand that just wasn't there anymore. It had simply vanished. The effect quickly spreading up her arm and out across the rest of her body. The last view of her face was of pearlescent tears forming in unfamiliar green eyes.
Dani?
I'm here. Her voice was shaking, and both of the other teens could hear the hiccup at the end of the sentence. Dani had never been a quiet crier, always winding up a hiccuping mess.
We're gonna figure this out.
We're gonna figure out what's going on, Tanya reassured, though it sounded a bit empty. Sam nodded, bright purple eyes searching the air in vain to find her. Am I dead? The question echoed through the room like a death knell.
No, you had a pulse. Your mom said you were fine.
Green eyes shimmered back into view, her face and body following quickly. Really? But look at me! I'm a ghost! Dani buried her head in her hands.
Well, you weren't a minute ago.
Well, you weren't a minute ago. She blinked at Tanya, who had spoken. What? But before any of them could speak, the sound of heavy footsteps came down the hallway and Dani balked. As she did, the rings of light reappeared, flashing out over her, leaving her looking like herself. She hissed in pain as she reached out to catch herself, and her hand brushed the star-covered bedspread. The few small items around the room that had been floating fell back into place, and the three of them blinked at each other. Jack knocked before peeking into the room.
Dani! You're awake! Maddie! She's awake!
Running footsteps pounded down the hall. Maddie and Jazz quickly piled into the room. It wasn't long before Sam and Tanya were ushered out of the room. Jazz joined them shortly in the kitchen. Mom and Dad are treating Danny's burned hand, but they say they haven't found out what that freaky thing that happened earlier was. Mom thinks you two should head home. Tanya was about to protest when Sam cut her off.
Is Dani okay, though?
Jazz nodded. As she can be, with nutjob scientists for parents. That was a familiar line from Jazz. She'd never believed in ghosts. She probably never would. But it meant that Dani wasn't in any danger. Sam nodded and stepped on Tanya's foot when she made to argue.
Tell her we'll see her at school tomorrow.
Jazz nodded. I will. Now run before Mom and Dad come wanting to babble on about ghosts. They nodded and quickly made their escape. As they walked down the sidewalk away from the sore thumb of a building that was Fenton Works, Tanya turned to Sam, a frown on her face. We shouldn't have left. Dani might need us. Sam nodded.
That's why we left. I don't know shit about ghosts. That's always been Dani's parents' thing. And something tells me she won't be too pleased if we tell them she's part ghost now. They fucking hunt ghosts, Tanya. What do you think they might do to her?
Tanya frowned. What are we gonna do? Sam let out a breath as they kept going down the sidewalk. He looked up and spotted a sign for his favorite bookshop in all of Amity Park. The Skulk and Lurk opened at 5 in the afternoon and closed at around midnight most days. So even now, with the sun firmly set, the deep purple of the neon sign glimmered.
We're gonna do some research.
He dragged Tanya into the bookshop, waving at the boy behind the counter. He, like Sam, wore almost entirely black. Though where Sam had a deep purple vest, this person had decided on a bright red choker with decorative jewels that looked like dripping blood. He looked up and nodded at Sam, used to the goth boy and his brightly colored entourage in the store. Sam wove through the bookshelves to a section carefully labeled in swirling script, Ghosts and Spirits. He began to run a finger down the shelves, plucking books off here and there.
Possession in You, Manifestations Malevolent and Minor, Tobin's Spirit Guide.
He pulled all of these off the shelf, tucking them under his arm as Tanya stared at him. What are you doing?
Research.
How are these gonna help? Tanya demanded.
You have a better suggestion?
Sam hissed. He pulled Tanya deeper into the bookstore.
We just watched our best friend die. Even if it was only like halfway. I don't know what else to do, so I'm gonna try and help the only way I know how.
Tanya stared at him, only now realizing that he was shaking, and there were tears in the corners of his eyes. They smudged his eyeliner as they spilled out, and he took a deep breath, releasing her arm. She nodded, pulling out her PDA. Well, keep your dusty old books. I'm gonna trust in the miracle of the internet. Sam let out a bark of laughter as Tanya retreated to one of the plush bat-winged chairs that hid the little nooks and crannies all over the bookshop. He turned back to his self-appointed task. He found a few more titles that looked interesting. A Study of Ghosts Through History, Spirit Herbology, Salt and Burn, A Supernatural Guide. He toyed with that last one, but decided to get it just in case. He paid and sought out Tanya in the armchair she'd chosen. She jumped when he tapped her on the shoulder. She checked the time on her watch and frowned. It was almost her curfew.
I've got what I need. We'll do some research when we get home and reconvene tomorrow with a plan, hopefully.
Tanya nodded and Sam walked her home. They paused just outside her house. Do you think she's gonna be okay? Tanya's voice shook. Sam didn't know how to reply. He was silent for a moment before he took a deep breath.
I really hope so.
Tanya seemed to take some heart from that as she raced up the steps of her house. Once she was inside, Sam headed home. He stayed up until his alarm went off that morning, compiling notes from all of the books, things they all agreed on, universal myths, anything he thought might be even semi-useful. He stretched as he headed out of his room to grab a quick shower before changing to head to school. Chapter 3. Researching the Impossible. The only problem with Sam's plan was that Dani didn't show up to school the next day. They cornered Jazz at lunch, and she admitted that her parents had wanted to keep Dani home in case there were any side effects from being so close to the portal when it opened. She was tutoring after school, though, so she entrusted them with the task of taking Dani the homework she missed. So at the end of the school day, Sam and Tanya headed to Fenton Works, only to find it mostly dark. Tanya pulled out the spare key, and they entered to a ringing silence that was more than foreboding. Slipping inside, they called out, voices echoing through the house. In a moment, something fell, but not from the stairs, from the ceiling. No, through it. The figure landed with a thump and a loud curse. Ow, ow, ow! Sam and Tanya raced forward. That was Dani. Are you okay? They practically said it in unison, and Dani looked up at them, eyes glowing eerily in the dark. She wasn't even transformed, but her eyes glowed bright green, looking practically radioactive in their frustration. They reached out and helped her to her feet. She looked up at them, a deep frown on her face. She was still in her pajamas, a NASA logo t-shirt proclaiming "I need space," and a pair of loose shorts. Her skin was slightly cool to the touch, and she shook her head, pushing her hair out of her face. This is the third time I have fallen through my floor. I almost got caught the second time and only didn't because I turned invisible and couldn't figure out how to turn back. So, that's my day so far. Sam gently steered her to the couch.
Well, that answers if you can do ghost stuff when you're human,
Sam said, trying to lighten the mood. I can't seem to turn it off, Dani said, hiccuping. Sam wrapped an arm around her as Tanya paced. Are your parents home? Tanya asked, and Dani shook her head. Do you think I'd be this calm if the ghost hunters I live with were home when I'm falling through the ceiling? They got a call. Some spectral activity in Elmerton. They said that since I haven't experienced any side effects from the portal, that they were going to go check it out and bring home dinner when they were done. Tanya nodded. Where are the plans for the ghost portal? Dani and Sam blinked at their friend. If Mom put them away, probably in the third drawer of the filing cabinet. If Dad put them away, God knows. Tanya nodded, turned on her heel, and raced down the stairs to the lab. Sam and Dani blinked at each other for a second before Dani quite literally slipped through Sam's fingers to follow Tanya. She hesitated at the top of the stairs.
You don't have to go down there,
Sam insisted, but Dani shook her head. I'm not letting Tanya go down there alone. Who knows what kind of damage that portal could do that it hasn't done already. But Sam could see Dani's distress in the way her feet barely brushed the carpet. As she took a wholly unnecessary step onto the stairs, the ring of light bloomed around her middle, and she again changed into the more ghost-like form. But this time, something new happened. Her legs seemed to fuse together into a wisp that curled and vanished. She was flying down the stairs, not just floating. Sam blinked, following her. They found Tanya digging in the drawer Dani had specified. In a moment, she pulled out a file in triumph. Ha-ha! She turned to head back up the stairs and screamed. Dani flinched back slightly. What? Tanya let out a breath. It's not nice to sneak up on people as a ghost, Tanya said, pushing her glasses up her nose. Also, since when can you fly? Dani blinked and looked down. She gasped, but there was an edge of excitement to it. I'm flying? She whirled in the air. Holy shit, guys, I'm flying! It was nice to see excitement back on her face as she spun through the air and right through the ceiling. Tanya and Sam blinked at each other as the echoing laughter faded. Not wasting a moment, they ran up the stairs, following the echoing laughter up to the roof access door. They found her hanging onto a satellite dish, giggling like mad. Guys, I don't know how to get down. Sam scrambled up the dish and grabbed her hand.
Okay, take a deep breath. You weren't flying in the living room, so think back to how that felt.
He was sort of grasping at straws, but it seemed to help as she floated down and her feet finally reappeared and touched the ground. Sam climbed back down and smiled. He reached into his leather jacket he'd worn for the day and pulled out a black notebook. On the front cover were the words, "Not today, Satan," in dripping red letters. Dani frowned at the book. Sam popped it open. It looked like it was full of his neat cursive handwriting.
I was up all night doing research on spirits and specters.
Tanya nodded. Same, but I did not take as many notes as Sam. But maybe we can make some sense of what the portal was supposed to do and figure out what went wrong from there. Dani stared at them and lunged forward, pulling them both into a hug. Thank you. You have no idea how much this means to me. I thought I was alone. Sam and Tanya returned the hug.
Never,
Sam assured, as Dani, still ghostly, grinned at them. She was still a good 6 inches shorter than him. Tanya pecked Dani on the cheek. We'd never leave you alone. You're stuck with us. Dani laughed. The white lights flashed, and she returned to herself. Now, I say we grab some snacks, head to your room, and try and work this out. Dani nodded, grinning at them, her eyes fading back to their familiar sky blue for the first time since they'd arrived. They ended up following Tanya's suggestion to the letter. Once they'd gathered their snacks and settled down in Dani's room, Sam cracked the notebook back open.
Okay, so Tobin's spirit guide was the most helpful guide-wise anyway. Less, here's how to hunt the supernatural, and more, here's what this is.
Dani bit into an apple and nodded. Yeah, I get the feeling I'm going to get more how to hunt the supernatural lectures now that stupid portal is working. Sam nodded and flipped to the first page of notes.
The general consensus about ghosts is that they're made of two things. Post-human consciousness, sort of an echo of the dead.
Sam said, reading off the notes. Dani nodded and spoke around her bite of apple. Yeah, Mom was lecturing Jazz and me about that the other day. I honestly sort of tuned her out after a while. Never thought I'd need it. The other thing is ectoplasm, right? Sam nodded.
Yeah, though no one seems to know exactly what it is.
Sam commented, and Tanya clicked her tongue. Your parents have a few thoughts about that. Your mom's notes on the ghost portal say it might be a substance from a pocket dimension, often referred to as the afterlife. Tanya shook her head. You know, in context, this is heavy shit. Dani shrugged. I died yesterday. I'm not sure it gets worse than that. Tanya nodded and continued. There's a few bold notes here about double-checking notes and making sure you use the ecto-purifier. Do not want a repeat of last time with the ecto-acne. What's ecto-acne? Tanya asked, frowning up at Dani, who ran a self-conscious hand over her face. Hopefully something I don't have to worry about. She shook her head, absently scratching at the bandage on her burned hand. Sam flipped a page in his notes.
What do the plans say about ectoplasm, Tanya? Because that comes up most in all the books I could get my hands on.
She flipped a few pages and made a noise of triumph at the back of her throat. Here we go. Your mom's notes are almost as good as Sam's. In theory, the device will allow access to the fabled ghost zone, which is often referred to as the afterlife in literature, though this is technically a misnomer, as it is unlikely that all post-human consciousness manifests as a ghost, spirit, or phantom. She skipped down the page. According to the brief scans collected from the original portal, she paused, looking up at Dani. Original portal? No idea, Dani said, hovering over to Tanya, though if her powers were manifesting from stress or excitement, this time was less clear. This is the first one they've ever made here. The Fentons had moved to Amity Park years ago, when Jazz was a small child, before Dani was even born. Tanya frowned, but went back to the notes. According to the brief scans from the original portal, the ghost zone is comprised entirely of ectoplasm. Dani sat back with a frown. I was in the portal when it went off. I got exposed to all of the ectoplasm in the ghost zone at once, and it killed me. Technically, it only half killed you, Tanya said, trying to be helpful. Dani ran her hands through her hair. It's sort of like a literal version of Schrodinger's cat. In the ghost zone, it killed you, but you survived here on Earth. I'm not sure if that makes me feel better or worse, Dani commented, scrubbing at her face. Sam frowned, opening his mouth, but before he could say anything, there was a clatter from downstairs, and Dani dropped back to the sheets of her bed. As she did, though, she opened her mouth, and a bright blue mist, like something that came off of dry ice, flowed from her mouth. She clapped both hands over her mouth, but it flowed out from between her fingers. She blinked. Sam and Tanya frowned.
That wasn't in any of the books,
Sam said, and Tanya shrugged. Dani pulled her hands away to say something, but another flow of blue mist escaped, and the room grew a touch colder. It was then that something rose from the floor. It was tiny, a little green blob with dripping ears that sort of looked like they maybe belonged to a rabbit at one point. Black, empty eyes looked around the room, and Dani tilted her head at the creature. It's a bunny. She stepped off the bed, not seeming to notice that Tanya and Sam had both flinched away from the thing. She knelt down on her floor and carefully held out a hand, not even realizing it was her burned one. The bunny seemed to nose at the air, though there wasn't really a visible nose on the rabbit. The only thing that defined it as such were the ears. Tension filled the room, though Dani seemed unusually calm about it. Then the bunny hopped right into her hand. It was tiny, though it did seem to drip ectoplasm. Sam wasn't looking forward to cleaning that up. You're harmless, aren't you? Dani said, smiling at the tiny blob in her hand. It made a noise that sort of grated on Sam and Tanya's ears like nails on a chalkboard or static from a TV. But Dani didn't seem to hear it. Instead, a similar sound slipped out of her mouth, like it was nothing. Maybe she just hadn't noticed, like with the flying in the lab, but her eyes weren't glowing this time. She turned to Sam and Tanya with a reassuring smile and spoke, but there weren't words. She frowned as they stared at her.
Dani, we can't understand you. I think you might be speaking ghost.
Sam deadpanned, not sure how to soften that blow. Dani frowned down at the blob in her hand, which nodded, as if affirming that yes, this strange teen who was holding a ghost in her hand was also speaking in the ghost's native tongue. Tanya frowned. Does this mean you can speak Latin? It's a dead language, too. Dani barked out a laugh, and the world seemed to snap into some form of familiarity. Sam couldn't hold his own laughter, and the three of them dissolved into giggles. Dani still holding the blob of bunny.